Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's tutorial video, which is how to draw fur. So I've selected 5 different types of fur which are most common, which you come across in pet portrait and wildlife portraiture, and I'm going to run through my tips and techniques of how to draw each one. So let's get straight into this tutorial, and to begin with I've decided to go with the classic short fur which you find on a lot of animals. So short fur is something that you usually find like on the face of an animal where it's really short around the nose, and any short-haired dogs, that kind of thing. So the kind of steps which I take for this one is to just start off with some light base layers. So I always like to work from light to dark whenever I'm using coloured pencil. So the first thing that I do is start with a warm grey 1 pencil and make sure it's really nice and sharp, and I start to shade back and forth in the direction that the fur is going in. So it's really crucial that you do follow the fur direction at all times. That's what's going to make it look really natural. You don't want to go off at any odd angles. You don't want to go horizontal if your fur is vertical. So you want to work in the direction of the fur and just start by gently shading your base layers. So you want to use really light pressure, and you just want to go back and forth using really short sort of shading motions. So it's really important to use short shading motions for the short fur, because obviously you don't want to use long shading strokes because otherwise it's going to look like long fur. So the key is to use short shading strokes and just work in the direction of your fur. And all I do is just build up a couple layers. So I work from my lightest colour, which is that warm grey 1, and slowly build up to my darker colour. So I like to use dark sepia for my darkest colour and just gently shade all of the layers up until I get to that darker colour. Then what I like to do is just gently shade that darker colour over the entire section so that I get that initial base colour down of that really sort of dark rich tone, and then I like to go over and I like to make some fur strokes. Now this is where it really starts to come together and really look like fur. So all I do is just point my pencil onto the paper and lift as I'm working along that fur stroke. So sort of like you're making a tick if you're sort of marking work, that kind of thing. So make like a tick motion with your pencil and really lift the pencil pressure as you come to the end of the fur stroke, and that's going to make it look really nice and soft. So if you was to study an actual hair from an animal, you will notice that the base of the hair where it attaches to the skin is really thick, and then as it comes along the fur it sort of gets really tapered and thin. So it works from thick to thin, and by using that motion with the pencil, by pointing it down and then gradually lifting the pressure off the pencil, you're going to create that sort of tapered effect which mimics the real life fur. So just making really short lines in that motion and in that manner, making sure that the pressure is initially light on the pencil just to get that initial lay down of colour, just working over the entire area and just putting down a nice layer of colour using those lovely fur lines. Then what I like to do is then go in with a bit of a harder pressure and sort of group the fur lines a little closer together so you get that sort of dark effect. So where you've got the lighter areas I've made less fur lines, and where you've got those darker colours I've sort of clustered a lot more of the fur lines together so you really get that dark effect. So that's pretty much it for the technique on short fur. It's just going in with the initial base layers of shading and then shading a few more layers in your sort of mid-tones, and then working up to your dark colours where you start to add those fur lines and start to add that texture. I also like to go in with a few fur lines with the white pencil, and that's just to really sort of highlight a few of those really bright white fur lines which are really sticking out on the reference picture. So the key to short fur is to shade and make sure your pencil is sharp, and then go in with some fur lines again with a sharp pencil and just add those fur lines and that texture. So let's look at the long fur. So this sort of works in exactly the same way as a short fur. Just start off the same way as I always do, and that's just shading the base layers with a really sharp pencil. But this time, instead of using some shorter shading motions, I'm elongating those shading motions. I'm elongating those pencil strokes because it is long fur. So for short fur you want to use shorter strokes, and for long fur you want to use longer strokes. So all I've done is just shaded the base layer in the direction that the fur is going in, making sure that I use those longer fur strokes for the long fur. And then what I'm going to do is just map in some of those darker areas with a dark pencil. So for this I'm using the walnut brown and just mapping in a few of the shadowed areas where some of the fur is overlapping some of the underlaying fur, and you've got this sort of really dark shadow on the fur there. So once I've put down those base layers and then mapped everything out, those sort of shadow areas with my darker colours, then I go in and work with my midtones. So I'm working from those lighter colours to the darker colours, and with the long fur I tend to shade for a lot more layers than the short fur. So with the short fur I just shaded a few layers, then went in with the fur lines, but for long fur I tend to shade a lot more, and that's because it's sort of long, luxurious fur. There aren't too many fur lines or details or anything that I need to add, so just shading some of the colours down and getting the tones and shadows right is the way that I go about doing the long fur here. I do add some fur lines and some of those sort of really dark areas with the dark pencils towards the end, just to add a little bit of texture. So for the reference that I was working from, there was a slight bit of texture. It wasn't really completely smooth and silky. There was a little bit of texture there. So I just went in with the dark pencil and just added a few fur lines. So the fur lines that I use for long fur are exactly the same as the short fur, but I elongate that stroke. So similarly with the shading, you elongate the shading for long fur. For the actual fur lines and the detail lines, I just elongate that sort of tapered line. So I use the same technique of putting the pencil onto the paper and slowly lifting the pencil off the paper as I come towards the end of the fur line. But these lines are a lot longer than those made in the short fur. So long fur and short fur are pretty similar in their technique. They use the same sort of shading and they use those fur lines as well. Wavy fur is a bit of a different beast in the fact that I like to map out each individual area before I start and then shade individual parts. So for the wavy fur, what I've done is just looked at the reference photo and I've just started to map out the direction in each clump. So when I'm working with wavy fur, I like to think of these areas in different clumps rather than a whole patch of fur. So with the wavy fur, you can see that I'm just sort of mapping everything out in the direction that all of these different clumps are going in. So what defines a clump is where the shadows end and where the shadows begin either side of a light area. That's what I classify as a clump, and what I do is just kind of look at the shape that it's making. Some of these make sort of half circles, some of them make triangles, and then I just map those down onto my drawing. So I like to map the direction that each little clump is going in as well. That really helps. Once I've done that, then I like to work from clump to clump. It makes the whole thing a lot more manageable. So I start with this large bottom clump, and what I do is then just fill in that base layer using that shading motion, using a really sharp pencil, and work in the direction of the fur. So I'm really looking at the reference photo, seeing which direction that particular clump is going in and adding that down. And then I go in and do some shading with my lighter colours. So I go in with some more warm greys, I go in with some light yellows and some light pinks, and just really start to flesh out some of the shadow areas and those lighter areas. And again, just working from light to dark, just making sure that I sort of blend out all the shadows as I go as well, just by using some shading motions with the pencil. And then I finally go in and add some really fine fur details with a sharp dark pencil. So for this wavy fur that I'm working on, the fur was kind of long, so again I used those sort of long fur lines and some long shading motions and just tried to make it look really light and fluffy. It's really important when you're creating this kind of wavy fur that you really pay attention to the shadows and the lights, because that is what's going to make it look really realistic and three-dimensional. So you need to pay attention to the sort of curvature of the waves, where the shadows are falling and where the light bits are falling. You also need to pay attention to where the actual light direction is coming from, as that will help you decide where to add all of those shadows and everything. Once I've done that first clump, then I move on to the next one and do exactly the same process. So I analyse from the reference which direction that the fur is going in that particular clump, add the base layer down using some light shading, and then slowly build up to my darker colours, adding in all the shadows and everything. And I apply the same process across each and every clump, just adding in the base layer, working in the direction of the fur, and then adding in those shadows. So when you look at the final piece, you can see that the clumps are all individually defined. All of them are sort of going in a slightly different direction, and by working clump to clump, it is a lot more manageable. You don't lose yourself as much, and the end result is really nice and wavy and soft. So once I have done each clump, I then look at the piece as a whole and then make any adjustments here and there where I feel that I need to add more shadows or more lights or anything. It's just so much easier to work on wavy fur in small sections like that. It makes it a whole lot more manageable, and as I said, you don't lose yourself, and it's a lot easier to determine which direction the fur's going in and add that fur direction in each of those individual clumps. So the next type of fur is curly fur, and this is the most difficult, and this is what I get a lot of people ask me about. A lot of people find this extremely difficult, and I'm not going to lie, it is a difficult type of fur to work with, but if you look at it in a methodical way and work at it in a methodical way, it becomes a lot easier. It's still difficult, but it makes the whole job a lot more easier. So the trick with curly fur is to treat it the kind of same way as we did with the wavy fur. So all I do is just look at the reference photo and I look at where the sort of dark parts are. So with the wavy fur we looked at the different clumps. This time with the curly fur we're looking at where those dark parts lay. So we're looking at the negative space between each of the curls. And what I do is just look at the shapes that those are making and map those down onto my drawing. So you can see that I'm just sort of mapping out all of these different dark shapes, and it kind of looks a little bit weird to begin with. But then once you start to fill in your base layers and then build up to your shadows, everything sort of starts to come together. But it's really important to look at the negative space between the curls and all of those sort of dark lines and the dark areas within that reference that you're working from. So we work in a completely different way to the other types of fur where we started with the light and then went dark. This time we're starting with the dark and then going back to the light and working our way back up to the dark again. So it's a completely different working process. But working this way with curly fur is a lot easier than just sort of adding the base layer and then going in and adding all those shapes. So once I've added the dark areas down, then I like to go through and add the base layers. And I do exactly the same thing as I did with the wavy fur. I work in individual sections. So I work on individual curls. So the first curl that I'm working on is to the left hand side, and all I'm doing is just adding the base layer down in the direction that the curl is going in. So with curly fur it's not just one straight line, you obviously have to snake your pencil about. So I'm just adding the base layer in the area of the curl, creating that sort of curl effect, that sort of S shape with the pencil as I'm going as well. And then from there it is just exactly the same process as the rest of the fur types. All I'm doing is just working from light to dark, adding in all of the sort of shadow areas and analysing where some curls are underneath and where some are over the top, and adding the appropriate shading. So where you've got some curls which are over the top of others, obviously the ones that are underneath are going to be a lot darker in colour. So I'm sort of analysing that on my reference photo and then applying that to the drawing by using relevant shading. So on the left hand side of my example you've got that main curl which is coming over, which is really light, and then underneath it you've got another curl, and I sort of shaded around the top curl, if that makes sense. And then it creates that shadow on that bottom curl and it makes it look like that top curl is really coming up and over the rest. Curly fur is mainly about analysing and looking at your reference photo. You really need to focus on your reference photo and see the shapes and the areas of light and dark and apply it to your drawing. You really need to take your time with curly fur as well. Don't try and rush it because it's going to look really straggly and it's going to look really unnatural. Just take your time, work in each individual curl and work all across your drawing, doing it curl by curl, just repeating the same process throughout. going in and adding those darker parts, then adding your base layers and working from light to dark and adding your shading. Working that way is just going to be really easy. You'll sometimes find it a little bit therapeutic. When I get into the flow of curly fur, I find it really, really good, but first starting off, it's a little bit daunting and it's a little bit tedious, but curly fur really deserves your patience and some perseverance. So just take your time with it and work in that way by mapping out those dark shapes and then going in and working curl by curl. The last type of fur is wiry fur, and this is one of my favourites to do, and I like to use an additional tool for this. So for the wiry fur, what I've done before I've added any colour down, I've gone in and used an embossing tool. And what an embossing tool is just a tool that has little ball bearings on the end and it indents your paper. So these are mainly used for like sculpting. A lot of people use them for nail art, but I like to use them to indent the paper to create grooves, and then when you add colour over those indented areas, the colour is not going to go in it because it's indented, and the colour is just going to go onto the top of the paper and avoid that groove that you've made with your embossing tool. So all I've done is just worked the embossing tool over, and I've sort of looked at the reference photo and seen where there are some of those lighter, really wiry fur lines sitting on top, and I've added those with the embossing tool. So I've just used the embossing tool like I would a pencil, just really putting pressure through it to indent the paper, and just added the lines in the direction that that wiry fur is going in. If you don't have an embossing tool, what you can use is a sharp white pencil. That works exactly the same, or you can use any kind of sharp tool which is going to indent your paper, but make sure it's obviously not a knife or craft knife or anything like that, because that's just going to cut your paper up. So once I've done those embossed lines, then I can go in with some colour, and you can see that as I'm adding the base layers in, the pencils are completely avoiding the areas and those grooves where I've indented the paper. So those white lines that we've embossed will stay white and they will shine on top, and it will look like the top layer of your fur. So now what you're free to do is to add your layers and layer up to dark. So you work in exactly the same way as with the rest of the furs, and you work from those light to dark colours, and you can really build up some really nice sort of shadow areas without having to avoid those white areas. So using an embossing tool really takes a lot of the effort out of the wiry fur for you. So the wiry fur I like to build up with shading like the other types of fur as well, and then I slowly build up to the darker colours and then use some fur lines. The fur lines that I use for wiry fur are a lot different to the other kinds of fur lines that I've used. I like to use some really sort of short, stark fur lines, some really blunt lines, so I don't like to use so much of that tapered edge on the fur line. So instead of lifting the pencil as I'm going along that line, I like to just sort of leave the pencil sort of almost touching the paper and not lift it as much, so that you get this sort of harsh, sharp edge. Wiry fur is really quite coarse and you want to try and create that effect, so all I do is make those sort of blunt-ish fur lines, and I also crisscross and overlap this kind of fur a lot more than the others. So the other types of fur, I was sort of keeping the fur lines in the same sort of direction, but with wiry fur I like to really overlap them and really exaggerate the wiry and messiness of it, and I think that it creates a really nice effect doing it that way. So that's pretty much it for that wiry fur. It's just a really simple process. The embossing tool really is a friend there, and you get a really nice effect, and it does look really wiry and coarse. So that's pretty much it for this fur tutorial, just really short, simple techniques on how I draw each type of fur. If you do want to watch this in real time with full voiceover, then it is available over on my Patreon page and to subscribers on my website as well, and I'll leave a link in the description if you want to go and check that out. I also have a ton of other tutorials, different wildlife and other different techniques as well over there if you want to subscribe. So I would really like to know what you guys find the most difficult type of fur to render. Obviously mine is curly fur. I always find it really difficult, and I always hate to draw something when I have curly fur involved. It is a real chore for me to do. So I'd love to know what your guys' worst type of fur to draw is. Let me know in the comments below. So I really hope some of the tips and techniques that I've shown here through these different types of fur have helped you or will help you in your future drawings. If you like this video, then make sure you give it a thumbs up, and if you're new around here and you love this video and you want to see more, make sure that you hit that subscribe button and tick that bell icon as well to be notified of all of my future videos. But anyway guys, I will see you in my next video. Bye!